Well, hello everyone, and thank you for coming to this event where we're going to try to make some kind of sense of the election that just happened in this country. My name is Jamie Aroosi. I'm a lecturer here in political science, and I'll be one of the panelists. Up after me will be Professor Jacob Segal from political science as well, Professor Michael Spear from history, and Professor Shawna Brandle from politics. The format of the event is that we're going to each give 5 minutes or so of introductory remarks. Then we'll have a conversation, and we're going to try to leave a lot of time for questions from you. So there will be plenty of time for that. Hopefully, we can get to everyone. So I'm going to start this event, and I have to say that over the past 2 weeks, sort of my remarks and how I was going to kick things off have sort of changed. And I had a very hard time trying to figure out how to sort of summarize the 2024 election in 5 minutes that would really make sense of how profound an event I think it is. And I think a lot of us think that. And it really only occurred to me last night that maybe one way of sort of setting the tone and helping everyone understand this moment in time is to look at this election historically, and I'm sure my colleague Professor Spears will correct much of what I have to say. But this election seems to me to be sort of the end of about a 100-year period of history in the United States that began with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. And those of you who know a little bit about American politics or American history might know that FDR was famous for what was known as the New Deal. And the New Deal was a series of programs and policies that sort of greatly improved the quality of life for average Americans. Some of those programs included, getting over a cold, and included things like workplace safety. This was a time prior to FDR when children labor at factories and on farms was common. When we instituted programs like Social Security, which is the pension program for retired people. We had massive back to work programs for people back to work after the Great Depression. And in general, this period of time saw a huge expansion of the government's role in our lives, and largely to improve the life of working people. And the reason that we talk about a middle class in the United States, people, a class of people that has a relatively affluent quality of life, where children have the ability to go to higher education, where people can own homes. That kind of lifestyle was really created in large part as a consequence of this set of policies. Government expanded to make life for average Americans much better. Now, that period of time lasted, depending on how you count it, 30 or 40 years. And we saw a huge expansion in the government that allowed people to improve their quality of life. Before 1932, home ownership was extremely rare. But after especially World War II, it became very common. So instead of, like a lot of us in New York, paying rent every month and not having anything to show for it at the end of the month, programs like the GI Bill let people put that money into their own property. So at the end of paying rent or a mortgage your entire life, you own something that improved people's quality of life. The problem, though, is that the way you fund those programs is by taxing. That's how the government operates. It taxes people, and then it uses that funding, that money, to pay for government programs. Now, no one likes paying taxes, but if you receive a lot in return for those taxes, it's not such a problem. I grew up in Canada, for instance, and in Canada we pay taxes, but we also get very high quality, affordable education. We get free health care. And so paying taxes doesn't hurt so much when you see how much you get in return. Problem is, if you're very wealthy, this logic doesn't make sense. If you have $1 billion, for instance, whatever you get back in terms of tax revenue whatever is spent on you, even if you get free healthcare, free education, is going to be way more than you paid in taxes. And so while slightly higher taxes and more benefits make sense for most people, for the very wealthy, it doesn't. And so starting in about the 1960s or the 1970s, we saw a big attack on the New Deal program, where sort of wealthy people wanted taxes slashed, they wanted government programs slashed. And I think that what we're seeing now is really the end of a 50-year project to sort of dismantle the government's attempt to make the quality of life for average Americans better. And so there's a lot that's very unique about this election, but to my mind, one of the consistent parts of this election is that it's really just an extreme point in a program to sort of undermine these kinds of programs that's been taking place for about 50 years. And I could go on, but time passes very quickly up here. So I will pass it next to Professor Segal.
Thanks so much, Jay. So I wanted to do a couple of things. One was to give an overview of the results as I see them, and then to look at a little bit at what we call the exit poll results, which are polls done of voters. Since, when election day, election period, since the early voting, you have all these people at the same place, voting for you, and you can poll them and get a sample of who voted for who, so various Democrats characters. So I did want to just go over the actual result, namely that Trump was elected president with 312 electoral votes to 229 electoral votes of Harris. But electoral votes always tend to distort the actual vote of the candidate, because the estimate is that Trump will get 49.8% of the national popular vote, and Harris will get 48.3% of the popular vote. In other words, Trump won, but marginally, slightly, in the national popular vote. And he didn't get to 50% of the national popular vote. Republicans picked up 4 Senate seats from West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Montana. In other words, 4 states that had Democratic senators now have Republican senators. And the Republicans therefore have 53 Senate seats to 47 for the Democrats. And the Republicans kept control of the House, but only very marginally, in the sense that a majority of the House representatives is 218, and they'll end up with probably 221 or so. It's therefore very important to remember that elections are swings by a very small amount of voters, right? That you wouldn't expect a major party candidate to get less than 45% of the vote, unless there's a strong third party candidate. So Trump's 49.8% is slightly high, is only a marginal shift in the vote. And I looked back at the past 4 elections, and I saw that Obama in 2012 got 51.1% of the vote. Hillary Clinton got 48.2% of the vote, 3% less. Biden got 51.3% of the vote, 3% more, and Harris is probably going to get around 48.3% of the vote. In other words, there's been a shift of 3% in each of these 4 elections. So the election wasn't a wipeout, it wasn't a landslide for Trump, it was a very slight victory. And we have to remember that Harris was running in a very negative context, that Biden is an unpopular president. He's been unpopular since the Afghanistan withdrawal. And inflation was a big problem for him, because inflation hurts everybody. And all the Western leaders who were in power during this inflation period, during COVID, have struggled electorally or been defeated already. However, so there's always this question about an election was it a realignment? Has a party now become dominant? And always the belief that after a big victory or a surprising victory, that the winning party now will be dominant. So in 2004, George Bush Jr. won a clear victory, and people felt like, okay, the Republicans are now going to be dominant and keep winning elections. But 2006 was a big victory for the Democrats. 2008 was Obama won by 7 percentage points, And then people thought, well, maybe the Democrats will be dominant. Democrats are the party of the ascendant. Democrats are the party of Latinos. Democrats are the party of younger women who have a college degree. All groups that seem to be growing. Democrats win the Asian vote. All groups that seem to be growing in terms of total population. Therefore, the coalition of the ascendant was the idea then, but that didn't last very long at all. In terms of the exit polls, we do see one that Trump did very well among Latino voters. That Harris only got 52% of the Latino vote, according to initial solutions. That might change, and so if Trump got 45% of the Latino vote, that's the best the Republican has done, in the modern era, and that's very significant. But we don't know whether that shift towards Trump means Latino voters are now Republican voters. It might have just been a reaction to inflation. Prior to the 1960s, for example, Southern white voters were Democrats, but they shifted over to Republican voters as a negative reaction to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And then over time, they became loyal Republican voters and conservative. They went from being Democrat and liberal in some areas to conservative Republican. And so the question therefore becomes clearly, will Latino voters become Republican voters over time? And is that a question of it's too early to tell? I think one very striking aspect of the election is the intense gender divide. And that consists among all races. Just to give an example, that Trump won, according to exit polls, 55% of Latino men. But Harris won 60% of Latino women, a huge gap in terms of gender. And the other issue always is education. That is to say, we're seeing a huge split among voters, among white voters. Harris won 52% of white voters with a college degree, and Trump won white voters with no college degree by 66%. A huge gap. But that gap does not exist in terms of people of color. Harris won 65% of voters of color with a college degree, and she won 64% of voters of color with no college degree. But I guess I'll stop here and we talk more about the next issue. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Professor Shawna Brandle. I have a couple of themes that I want to talk about. Professor Segal already did a really good job talking about some of the results, but I'll be talking about turnout, the rules, polarization, succession planning, and thank you to my comparative politics students who are here, the comparative element of all of this, because I am by nature a comparative politics person. Technically, American government is really just one subset. It's a single end case study, but there's a lot of American political scientists. So we call our own subfield. So I want to pick up, since Professor Segal just pointed, the gender aspect of this. And it's hard to draw too many conclusions from one thing. This is one election. And it's a weird one, right? It's not in our modern era, in my lifetime, there hasn't been a switch of a major party candidate this late in the game. Right, and we have to talk about gender. Right now, we've had two major parties run a woman for president or a woman identifying person for president. Neither of them have won, but two is a small case study and they're specific. So it's really hard to try and make causal claims, especially 2 weeks into things. It's really interesting, and Zara and Christian will know from my comparative class, whether one of the questions we've been asking is Trump a blip or is Trump a new norm? With the re-election, it seems more likely to be something broader. To that point, jumping around, thinking about, since we brought up the 2004 election, I started teaching the 2008 election in 2005 because there was a term limited president, right? So Trump, when he takes office, will be term limited. He cannot be president again after this term unless there's a constitutional amendment. And that's really hard to do. It takes 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of state legislatures. So it's unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. So then who would this person start, who gets to be the heir apparent? Maybe the vice president, J.D. Vance, maybe not, right? So it'll be interesting to see what kind of succession planning happens and what kind of coalitions start forming on the Democratic side as well. I want to think about voter turnout, right? And hit again the point that Professor Segal made about not winning a majority, right? So it's a plurality is when you win more than the other guys, but not over 50%, and that's what Trump has. This is not unusual. We don't have a majoritarian system at the national level. Some states have it involved in their state government. That's why you have to have a runoff in, like, say, Georgia or Louisiana. Lots of other countries run this because it's very unlikely the way we run presidential elections that someone would win a majority, right? Those are the exceptions, not the rule. And that's not something we think about. Because we think about democracy, we think majority rules, right? Very simple. But in fact, it depends on the specifics of the rules. So here it's plurality rules. And it's not just plurality rules, it's plurality rules in different states. So again, we have to look at, this is different than in 2016, where Donald Trump won a majority of the electoral college votes, but not of the popular vote, right? He didn't win a plurality, he actually lost, came in second in that element. But the popular vote doesn't matter, right? If you've ever voted for president, no, you haven't in the US. None of us have, because we all can only vote for electors, right? And this year in New York, it didn't even have the elector's name, it just said electors for, in tiny little writing underneath the big person that you were voting for. So looking at that, and again, with the specific exit polling that we have now, I don't know that it would have made a huge difference in the ultimate outcome. In 2016, absolutely a different outcome. In some other elections, absolutely a different outcome. But right now, you might say, wait a minute, how can it be a 1% difference, 48% to 49%, but then the Electoral College looks like a blowout, right? 300 something to 200 something. That's because states allocate, all but 2 states allocate their Electoral College votes as a winner-take-all situation. So you get, if you get 51% in Texas, you get all of Texas's votes. Same with Florida, same with California. Now that is a change that states can make in their own state constitutions and their own state laws. They don't need a national constitutional amendment. So if states did that, we would get an Electoral College vote that was more in line with whatever the popular vote is. But none of the big states want to do it. Currently, the only states, anybody know the states? Maine and Nebraska. And between them, they have 9 Electoral College votes to rub together. So not really a big difference maker. But the bigger states have said they would be interested in doing it, but they don't want to do it if they're the first. So it's kind of this like waiting game that they're all waiting on. I want to talk a little bit about campaign spending. Does anybody know how much money was spent on this election? Take a guess. We'll go Price is Right rules, closest without going over.
A small budget of $1 million.
$1 million, okay.
Trump, 400 million.
Anyway, I'm going total election. So this includes, yeah, total election.
My bad.
That's
can
fine.
I go with
Yes, please.
3 billion.
3 billion. Anybody else? Please. $1 billion? 2 billion, okay. 16 billion overall. That's B billion. If you've never thought about how much bigger a billion is than a million, I encourage you to think about it because we literally I can't understand it. Maybe you have better quantitative understanding than I do. But $16 billion, and that is, the Trump campaign was estimated at like a little over $1 billion, 1.65 billion for Harris. Then there's all the other campaigns that happen. And there's a couple of,
Quick question. Do you know how much money was given during the pandemic, like collectively to like all the states? Do you know roughly how much money?
in terms of campaign spending or how much money was given out in terms of grants?
I know how much money was given like during COVID, like the refund checks that they were given to.
I don't know. The point I think you're making, I 100% agree with, is like, I bet there were a lot better things we could do with $16 billion as a country. Like feed people, house people, educate people. And there are, again, here's where comparative is really interesting. We interpret campaign spending in the United States as a form of free speech. So Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976 says, this is free speech, so we can't limit it, right? You can't. So that meant individuals could spend as much as they wanted on their own campaign. And then we get another case, Citizens United in 2010, and said, well, corporations are people too. So they have free speech, and if you limit the spending that corporations can spend on elections, then you're limiting their free speech. So Citizens versus United got rid of, in 2010, the limits on corporations and organizations and union spending. And then McCutcheon versus the FEC in 2014 says, well, if corporations are people too, then people are people too. And putting individual limits on their spending on other people's campaigns is also unconstitutional. So since those cases, we've just gone up and up and up. I'll give you a comparative case. France, you cannot buy airtime. You are not allowed. Every candidate gets the same amount of airtime. You cannot, and therefore there's way less campaign spending because they're not allowed to spend it, right? You can't buy more time. You can't buy more speech. So that's seriously a concern. Let me see what else. We could talk about increasing polarization, but I'm over time, so hopefully somebody else will. My questions for you as the audience: why do you think it went down like this? And if you were eligible to vote but didn't, why didn't you? Oh, sorry, one more minute, guys, I beg you. Okay, so we had a fairly close, and with a two-party system because of Commissioner's Law, we're always going to have this major two parties, and it's always going to be pretty close. So it was about 76 million-ish to 73 million-ish. They're still counting the votes up. How many people were eligible to vote in the US but didn't vote? Oh, no, I wasn't asking for how many. What's the total number you think? 76 million voted for Trump, 73 million-ish voted for Harris. How many people were eligible to vote? Because eligible to vote isn't everyone in the US, right? There's 340 million people-ish.
5 million.
5 million? I saw another hand, so do you need the number? Okay. 90 million people in the US. So more people didn't vote. If all of those people who were eligible to vote but didn't vote voted, then they would beat either of the other two. It's not quite that simple because they're not all a monolith. When we talk about voter turnout, and by the way, my 18 to 24-year-old friends, the boomers and older are going out and voting, and not it's just in terms of a generational age person. There's structural reasons for that, but their version of long-term benefits and short-term costs is very different for you than yours, right? Because for our boomers, for our parents or grandparents, they've got, hopefully, we hope we have grandma forever, right? But 10, 20, maybe 30 years. Whereas 10, 20, 30 years, you guys are starting middle age, right? And your lifespans are going longer. So it's really important that you get involved. I've already talked too much. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
Great. Okay, my timer. So yeah, actually, all three of you sort of said stuff that I was going to say, so maybe I will be brief, but who knows. I want to pick up, Janie, you did a great job historicizing in some ways with, you know, the New Deal and how it develops in the 1930s, begins to fall apart in the 60s and 70s. And I think maybe one thing I'll do is try to talk about what happened after the 70s. And I think particularly what happens after the 1970s is the Democratic Party kind of shifts to the right, I would say, and sort of, you know, accepts the idea that they're going to have to deprioritize helping unions. Clinton sort of ends welfare, you know, to some extent. You see Clinton also being sort of tough on crime, so they move to the right. And I think they do that because they think it'll work. You know, they're being kind of slammed by the Republicans as being accused of being sort of soft on crime, spending too much money and things like that. So I think there's a logic to that. And they also, I think, and Professor Segal mentioned this, I think they think that it's actually a viable electoral strategy, that they don't really need the working class in a way. Let me quote our fine Senator Chuck Schumer in 2016. He was asked, like, well, are you worried about losing the working class vote? And his reply is, for every blue collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we will pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And he can repeat that in Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So I think there was sort of an acceptance on the Democratic Party that they could win without the working class, but at least the white working class. They still believe that they could maintain the support of working class blacks and working class Latinos. So that was the electoral strategy, and in some ways it works. You know, to some extent. I mean, Bill Clinton's elected twice, Obama is elected twice, but I think that strategy, in some ways, like one thing we could talk about more is that it does appear that Trump did a lot better among the working class than Harris did. And that is, I think, a significant shift. Maybe the shift is not huge, as Jacob points out, and maybe it's not permanent. But there is a shift. There's a funny thing where the Democratic Party, the party of the New Deal, the union movement, is now doing better among people making over 100,000. And the Republican Party, I think the exit polling shows, did better on people making under 100,000. So there's this interesting shift. I personally still feel, despite my sort of critique a little of the Democratic Party, I believe the Democratic Party does policies are slightly better for the working class, but they have sort of moved to the center and they've sort of taken Democrats for granted. So I think that was a key turning point. I think another key turning point, I think maybe Jacob mentioned this, is the 2008 economic collapse. And I think the 2008 economic collapse marks a moment where it really shook American politics and also international politics. And I think all of us have said a little bit, like, we should really think about this as imperative. What's happening in the United States is also happening in Europe. So for instance, the Democratic Party sort of shifts to the right in the 1980s, 1970s. The Labour Party in England with Tony Blair shifts to the right. So it's sort of an international phenomenon. What happened in 2008 with the economic crises is, I think, an eruption of anger on the part of people around the world. And that anger, like historians and political scientists often call it populism. So the rise of populism, sort of an angry politics, like the people are somehow being screwed. Okay, and there's kind of a left-wing and a right-wing version of that populism. And a left-wing version is like, well, the people are being screwed by corporations or something like that. And you see with Occupy Wall Street, you see with Bernie Sanders or AOC, that's kind of left-wing populism. But you also see kind of a right-wing populism, which is, the people are being screwed by the elites. And the elites are, the right-wing populists are not necessarily corporations. They are like kind of cultural elites. These well-educated academics or something like that who are snobs, or people who control the media. And also, I think with the right-wing populism, not always, but there often is an anti-immigrant tendency in a right-wing populism. Like the people, they define the people as people who are here, who are citizens, and they are being threatened by these outsiders, who are coming in, taking their jobs. And so I think Trump is a great example of that kind of right-wing populism. And And that right-wing populism, I think, appeals to a lot of working class people, working class whites, who begin to move the Republican Party as early as the 1960s and 70s. But there's a lot of historians who write about how NAFTA, this free trade agreement that Clinton negotiated in the mid-90s, you see a lot of Southern whites who had remained within the Democratic Party begin to say, no, these people, where I grew up, there used to be a lot of textile mills. Those textile mills were all closed down in the 1990s. In response to the free trade agreement. They all moved to Mexico. And, those people switched to the Republican Party, and they begin to think, well, what is the Democratic Party doing for us? So I think in some ways, the Democratic Party shift to the right has allowed the Republican Party and Donald Trump, who is, I think he's a damn skilled politician, and has a certain charisma about him. He's able to tap into those fears and cultural resentment. And I think that explains why. And he's, what else I'd say about that in particular? And I think Harris, in a way, Harris was put in a tough position. Again, Biden stayed in too late, too long. If Biden had stepped down earlier, maybe Harris would have been able to do better. I think the problem was in the midterms 2022, the Democrats did quite well. They go, well, we could do well. And they thought they could win really on two issues. They could ignore economic issues. They could focus on democracy. Trump is a threat to democracy. And so basically, democracy and Dobbs, I would call it. Again, Dobbs was the Supreme Court decision. You guys know what Dobbs did? Anyone? Dobbs Supreme Court case? It invalidated Roe v. Wade and left it up to the states on whether the abortion would be legal or not. So I think the Democrats, they were successful in the midterm election. Like, wow, we win by just like slamming Trump as this evil tyrant, and we will get the women's vote. And that will be sufficient. But that was not sufficient, because of inflation, because of the fact that they were losing the working class. And as Jacob points out, also this idea that they could maintain the support of the Black vote and the Latino and the Asian vote, this really is not really the case. They did do well among African Americans, but I think turnout, I don't know if there's any exit polling of turnout for Black voters.
Segal, I think, for
Segal.
2020.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Again, she won about 7 million less votes than Biden. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So, I think turnout was relatively low. And again, as you see, like Latino mix was over in the Republican Party. That is my time. So yeah, I'll end there. I think it'd be kind of interesting to talk about issues also the role of the media is one thing that I'd love to hear people think about the role of media, and also how this is going to play out in New York City, which also saw Trump doing significantly well, particularly in Latino, Asian, Jewish communities.
I wanna just poke in answer your question, Dr. Corby, our online moderator, had said pandemic spending was $1.8 trillion went to families, 1.7 trillion went to businesses, and the other 2 trillion went to states, healthcare, and other. Thank you.
Yeah, that's, I want to also, I realized, Professor Spear was talking that are very neglectful in mentioning that, we have a lot of online attendance, which we're very happy about. But Professor Corby is, moderating online. She told me that, we have a lot of questions online. And I'm sure that means we have a lot of questions here. So, I initially thought that we were gonna have a lot more discussion between us, but, if it sounds good to you, I thought maybe we each have, we can go straight to questions. We can each have a couple of minutes to respond. You want to go to questions?
Straight to questions.
Okay, let's do questions then. So we'll try to alternate, I guess, between in-person questions and online ones. So does anyone here? Yeah, would you like to start?
So, you were, I don't know your name, but you were talking about the people that, were eligible to vote but chose not to. So if you think that they actually did vote, like, would the results have been any different?
Well, that's always a very fascinating question, non-voters, how would they vote? Over time, in the past, it was always thought that more people voting would help the Democrats because there tend to be more Democrats than Republicans in the country, and then it was thought that lower income people tend to be Democrats and also are less likely to vote. Because Trump is winning a higher share of lower income people, that theory is maybe disputable. We do know that Republicans probably turned out infrequent voters more than Democrats did. So an infrequent voter is somebody who's maybe voted once in the past four elections. And both Democrat and Republican parties have voters like that, right? And does the Republican infrequent voters voted more than the Democratic voters, probably, which indicated maybe a wider pool of voters would not necessarily help the Democrats. But it's a very good question, and the answer obviously sometimes can't be known.
Thank you.
I think it would absolutely change the outcome because more people. I don't know if it would change who wins, but right, if you have a wider electorate, because the purpose of political parties and candidates is to get elections. How do they do that? By getting enough people to vote for them. So if you become a part of your group, your organization, your community becomes reliable voters, then you get attention paid. No political party in America is going to touch Social Security because you know who always votes? Old people, grandma and grandpa, get out there. And there's a lot of structural reasons here too, right? We often slag on youth for not voting. Number one, it's not just youth. And number two, right? Grandma and grandpa generally don't have anything else to do on election day. And we have elections on a work day here. So there's all sorts of comparative data we can use, like Australia, everybody votes. There's a fee, there's a fine that you have to pay. It's not really enforced, but if you don't show up and mark the ballot in some way, you owe $25. It's not really enforced, and there's a real high culture of voter turnout. In India, everybody votes because it's a 2-day holiday. No one's allowed to go to work. No one's allowed to school. There's literally nothing else to do. You might as well go. We have different outcomes in the states, right? Oregon for 15 years has had vote by mail only. So in Oregon, and unsurprisingly, Oregon has much higher voter turnout. So it's interesting to see this. And one more layer to throw in here is that in 2013, I know we threw a bunch of Supreme Court decisions at you. I'll give you one more. Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So Voting Rights Act of 1965 was part of all the civil rights movement legislation and what the thing that Shelby gutted was the pre-clearance requirement. So there are ways that you can, what's in the Constitution about voting, all the states have to adhere to. So that's why it's always a Tuesday. And if we want to get it not on a Tuesday, we need a constitutional amendment, which is really hard. Everything else is left to the states. And so we know prior to the civil rights movement that the states disenfranchised Black people, right? We know all the different ways they did that. And some of the districts got so bad, they had so many shenanigans. The Voting Rights Act said, you have to pre-clear the changes you want to make before the election. You have to approve them, submit them for approval so we can see that they're not just racism in full form. And Shelby, the decision was like, yeah, it's been a long time. You've been good. It's not fair that you have to pre-clear and nobody else does. So unsurprisingly, since Shelby County, there's been a huge increase in voter suppression laws and practices, right? From 2020, there's been over 100 different pieces of legislation introduced in multiple states that have the effect of suppressing voter turnout.
Even in New York?
In New York, we've stemmed the tide a little, right? Because we have early voting, but we are still an advanced registration state. So I had one student who wanted to vote, but didn't realize they needed to register in advance. California has automatic voter registration, right? Because, right, if you were born in New York knows they have your birth certificate. If you went to school here, they have your birth certificate and your education stuff. If you're a CUNY student, they have your data the state has. So California says, we have everyone's information. You're automatically registered if you're here. And if we miss you, you're allowed to same day register. New York, we don't have either of those. And more than that, you're required to update your voter registration every time you move, right? Even if you move technically in the same building to a different apartment, you have to update the registration. That being said, we do have early voting. So we have had early voting since 2019. And that has really reduced some of the lines in a lot of communities, the wait time, because it makes it easier for people to put it in their schedule. I always think about voting, I think about working parents on election day, because most schools, public schools are closed as their polling places. So then you have your kids and you have to go to your job and you have to find time to vote, and there might be a line and kids don't want to wait in line at Disneyland and you're going to make them wait in line with you to vote? Like, no. That was a really long answer, but yes, generally I'm in favor of bigger turnout.
So I just want to add two small points about voting. As I mentioned, I grew up in Canada and voting there is totally different. So I don't think I had a voting experience in Canada that took me longer than 60 seconds. And where the ballot also is extremely easy. The first time I voted, I'm an American citizen now. The first time I voted here, the complexity of the ballot, the number of people they need to vote for, the fact that there are multiple party lines, that there are huge lines to show up. It's just, and not just that, but like, you know, I'm a political scientist. I get a little bit nervous when I'm dealing with election stuff because of the punishments that come because of prosecutions for, voting illegally. And I know I'm not trying to vote illegally, but, people get prosecuted for making mistakes. So it's just an extremely difficult, very fraught situation here. And it doesn't have to be that way. And the other point I wanted to make is just in some of the comments sort of up until this point, it's occurred to me, there are, I think, a couple of different ways to think about all of this information that I think as political scientists, we tend to think of elections and the electorate like in very scientific ways. We want to study it. We want to look at the demographics. We want to look at percentages, and which your question about like what would happen if turnout increased is like one way. Well, so we sort of study it dispassionately. Let's look at what these people believe. Let's see how that would affect the election if they turned out. But I think there's a different way of looking at politics, which is rather than sort of looking at it dispassionately, to look at it maybe proactively, I'm not sure what the term is, and to realize that like with all of these undecided voters or these voters who don't turn out, that it's unclear how they would vote, that this group of people is an opportunity, that voters don't just have opinions that are sort of static, and so let's take a poll of those 90 million people who don't vote, and then we can put it into a model and see, well, what would the next election be like if they all showed up? But rather, the question is, well, what would happen if a political party took these 90 million people seriously and started lobbying them and started developing policies that would attract them and tried to shape their opinions? And the same with existing voters, right? We see with this election, former Biden voters, former Obama voters voting for Trump, which seems like a very big jump, but it's because people's opinions change, and our opinions about politics are not just these things that we're born with, but that are shaped by politicians, by the media. And so rather than just studying, what people believe and how they might vote in 2028, I think we also have to sort of think about, well, what can we do to shape these opinions so that 2028 turns out in the way that we want, or that 2032 turns out in the way that we want, because politics is really, part of studying politics is learning that all of this is always in flux, that there are no definitive answers, that you can change people's minds, that you can build coalitions, that you can change politics, right? That's the whole purpose of politics, to learn how to change things. And so I just wanted to introduce that sort of, perspective looking at things, because I think, otherwise it's very easy to take a passive attitude where politics, we just need to sit back and study and look at what people think and, okay, well, that's what it is. And now we know, and end of discussion, rather than seeing politics as, well, what can we do about this? You want to take a online question?
We have a fiery question from online. I think one of the policies Trump advocates for is mass deportation and the elimination of the 14th Amendment. Will this be a nationwide mass deportation among all states, including blue states, or will Trump let each state decide? Solid question.
Yeah, now we're getting serious.
Well, I mean, I think, even just literally, I think today, you're saying to the use of military or something like that. I think one of the things, I think that'd be tragic that people should resist it. One thing, science that's brought up that night is that policing the United States is kind of locally controlled. So in a sense, you can be resistant to the local level. And that happened, I think, the first Trump administration, when he proposed doing deportations and things like that. Some cities declared that we were sanctuary cities that would not actively work with ICE to sort of have people deported. And so that hopefully will happen in cities in New York. And I think that's something for us to think about at CUNY too. We have a lot of undocumented students at CUNY who might feel under threat. I think it's important, maybe not this meeting, but other meetings to to people to know what resources are. So I think he might try it. I think there will be massive resistance. The 14th Amendment, I think that would be constitutionally sort of, not, he wouldn't be successful with that. But, he probably, again, this is one of the great tragedies, of course, is that, of course, he lost is that me?
No, it's somebody in the.
Okay. I was thinking about this the other day, when he beat Hillary Clinton, he lost the popular vote. Actually, this is the first time a Republican has won the popular vote, I think, since 1988. But he lost the popular vote, and it was a very close election. If Hillary had won that election, we would have a 6-3 majority. The liberals would have a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. So it's so interesting to think about how there's also certain moments where history could have taken a different direction. And if we lived in a true democracy, he would not have been president in 2016. He would have probably disappeared, gone back to be like a real estate person or something like that, a TV guy. And then we would have a totally different Supreme Court. But now we have a Supreme Court which is pretty reactionary, and I think it's going to probably get worse.
I wanted to mention, that according to the polls were indicating for the election that there was majority support for mass deportation. But if you look at the exit polls, when given a choice, 56% of the people who were polled in this said that undocumented immigrants should be offered a check legal status, and 40% that they should be deported. The polling often depends on how you ask the question. Often, for example, a death penalty will get majority support for polling. But if you ask people, should people be given life imprisonment or death penalty, that's like 50-50. So in the same way that if people are asked, should illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants be deported, the majority say yes. When given a choice between deportation and legal status, a majority wanted legal status.
Yeah, I'll maybe just add that first about the 14th Amendment and other talk of other amendments that, we can't say that it's impossible because technically there are legal ways to change amendments, to get rid of them or to add them, but it's about just as impossible as a thing in politics. So the likelihood of any changes to the Constitution happening are, next to nothing. And I was sort of thinking about mass deportations, in addition to like the resistance to that happened in the first Trump term, this is maybe a good time to talk about how ineffective Trump was as a president, which is maybe not easy to see because of how dramatic the presidency was. And, you know, in the past 2 weeks, I've been noticing some of the appointments to different cabinet positions, like RFK Jr., who doesn't believe in vaccines, to head Health and Human Services. So we are getting some very, I don't know how to put it, some very strange is like an understatement, appointments to be heading government. And what we're seeing is basically that I think one of the lessons that Trump learned from the first term is that you have to appoint, or he feels, I think, like he has to appoint people who are essentially yes men, people who are just going to say yes and do whatever he says. But the problem with that is that the government is huge, right? There are, you know, I don't know how many civil servants, well over 1 million civil servants who work in the department, right? Just in the Department of Justice and Homeland Security, hundreds of thousands of people. And these are organizations that function. People go in, they have their jobs, and you cannot just go in. I mean, imagine that you're appointed to, you know, the head of, you know, a corporation, you know, you're the new CEO of Citibank, and we have some crazy idea about giving out free money. But well, you know, you just can't do that, right? You have an organization to run. You have to run that organization effectively and charismatically, and in a way that the people are gonna that work for you are gonna follow you if you want to get anything accomplished. And from the cabinet appointments that I'm seeing, it just does not look like President Trump is taking the job of actually running the government seriously. So, you know, in the first Trump presidency, you know, we looked at presidents like, what kind of new laws do they pass? And really, the one big law that's passed was a tax. There weren't really, you know, he wanted to try to repeal Obamacare. He couldn't get that done. He tried other policies as well. He couldn't really get that done, in part because, you know, to be president requires a lot of skills. It requires a lot of knowledge of how government operates. And there are people who spend their lives making government operate well. And you have to understand these people. You have to understand how to get them motivated, how to get them to achieve your goals. And the kinds of people that he is appointing do not seem like the kinds of people that are going to be effective leaders of government. And so my suspicion, and this is just an early suspicion, is that to a certain extent, we are going to see, when it comes to like passing new laws or trying to get his agenda accomplished, a lot of obstruction, not just from people who are resisting, but also out of the sheer fact that I don't think he has a great understanding of actually how to do the things that he wants to do. And the past couple of weeks hasn't really made me confident that he's going to be able to do a lot of these things that he's talking about. And so mass deportation seems extremely unlikely to me.
I'm gonna jump in.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to jump in. I think that my colleagues are too optimistic. I study international relations, comparative politics. It is unlikely that the president will get a change through the Constitution, but the Constitution is just a piece of paper. If you don't adhere to it, if you don't believe in it, and then more specifically when it comes to deportations, we have instances, right? So the internment of Japanese Americans, both people who were not U.S. citizens, as well as U.S. citizens, natural born U.S. citizens of Japanese descent during World War II, was upheld both during and after the war as a legitimate use of foreign policy powers, right? That the president in times of crisis or emergency is allowed to act, particularly in foreign policy issues. So there are some constitutional avenues where you could see the use of U.S. military power on domestic soil. And this would be a really big red line. These are the kinds of things that keep me up at night. These are the kinds of things that I hope really smart people are organizing around, because it is very possible. And if you would say, you know, in the first one, I think sort of you can read these cuckoo banana pants, that's actually insulting to cuckoos and banana pants, but you can read the appointments that are coming out, somebody who has active House investigations for Attorney General, you know, probably committed some not so great crimes, and he's going to be the primary law enforcement agent for the United States. You can read that as someone who doesn't know what they're doing, or you can read that as someone who has no intention of going through the normal usage of power, right? So I'm disturbed about that, but another question?
That's not a good question. I really had a problem with really going back when we look at how this country was developed. According to Professor Spears, who is my professor, when he took us back to history, learning about the Lenape and the tribal people that were here in this country originally first. And when the Dutch came, how things changed and they saw the beauty of this country. Now, originally, this country, what built the fabric of this country is the many different races that we have here in this country today. That's what makes this country great. So my thing is the question that I really ask internally is that President Trump, if he wants to mass deport the people that are here, let's say who are illegal, if you really go back in history, a lot of the people that are in this country were people that came to this country. They were not originally from this country. And that's what really built on the fabric of this country, the different races. And sometimes we don't give credit actually on the people that actually built this country. And starting from New York City, which with the trade of the sugarcane and all of that, and England and all of that, building up all these countries. And the fact that now America is, what I want to know is why is he so worried about who's coming here, based that originally this country was taken. People just came and they took it. And they just made all these laws that to say who should be here and who should not be here. And I think that's unfair because there's so much different people here, that's what makes this country great.
You should write speeches for Harris. I'll start very briefly. You're right. This is a nation of immigrants. We're all immigrants, and that's what makes America, the United States, great. But as we also well know, that tragically, there's always been this kind of virulent anti-immigrant sentiment there that has sort of come to the surface at certain points. So this is not the first time. And there were the Irish, the way the Irish were treated, or when in a New York City history class when Jewish people tried to come here in Stuyvesant and try to keep them out. But there's always been that sort of like the others coming in. And and the Chinese immigrants, Jewish immigrants who came in later, anti-Muslim stuff that's going on today. It's always been there, and it's America is in some ways has this sort of love-hate relationship with immigrants. And I think one of the tragedies is that you have to make an argument. I think you were incredibly sort of articulate about it. I think what happens is like Obama deported more people than Trump did. The Democrats, I think, have said, well, we got to come across as being tough on the border as well. And so they that's what Harris said, be tough on the border. I understand you have to be practical about politics, but you also have to make a vision. You have to make an argument to try to convince people. And I think one of the great tragedies, of course, is that we see someone who's an immigrant, 30 years later, they start saying, oh my God, these immigrants are coming in and taking our jobs. So it's one of those tragic things. One group comes in and they get angry about the new immigrant that sort of comes in after. You need to have a political party, you need to have labor movements, you have to have social movements that articulate a pro-immigrant argument. Otherwise, it's understandable that people fall into this sort of like fear of immigrants. You have to make a real clear argument, and I don't think the Democrats have been very good about that.
If you look at the exit polls, look at my Bible, you see that the question of who do you trust more to handle immigration, Trump, 53% of the people said Trump and 44% said Harris. So I do think that the influence of there was a huge influx of undocumented migrants during the first 2 years of the Biden administration. And that has caused pressure in communities. It's been a budget crisis for New York City. So some of this animosity is rooted in, I think, the practical problem.
Well, maybe also, I realized when I gave my opening comments, I don't know that my point was exactly clear, but when we talk about democracy, the easiest way to talk about democracy is to talk about it in terms of the vote. And we have a democracy if we're allowed to vote. But I think, a bigger question to ask about democracy is outside of the vote, who does government serve? And I think the question to ask, like, does government serve the majority of people or does it serve the minority of people? And, you know, the majority of people are always going to be working class people, middle class people, you know, people who are rich. And the minority is always going to be, you know, very rich people. And we're living at the end of sort of a 50-year period where inequality has grown year in and year out. In other words, where wages for just about everyone have stayed flat for about 50 years. But the people at the very top just keep getting richer and richer and richer and richer and richer and richer to the point where it's just, you know, I think I heard Elon Musk made something like 50 or 60 billion dollars since the election. It's just, I can't even imagine what that's like. I don't even think Elon Musk can imagine what kind of money that is. It's just, it's unfathomable. It's too much money to be able to think about. And so if that's the case, though, if this is the trend in American politics where government is increasingly just helping these people get wealthier and keeping more wealth, the problem that you have is that we still live in a democracy where people get to vote. And so eventually people are going to use that vote and say, well, maybe we should pass laws that make it easier for the majority of people, even if that means making it a little bit harder for the people at the top. People at the top don't like it. And so throughout American history, one consistent way of diverting attention from where the problem really originates is to find vulnerable groups. Those vulnerable groups have been, you know, new immigrant groups, have been minority groups, have been groups with different sexual orientation, right? And these vulnerable groups who can't really fight back for themselves are easy targets to take the blame for a problem that has nothing to do with them, right? How would we, you know, if things are tough in this country, right, the last people you would point to as the cause of that problem are the people who have the least amount of power, right? But they're an easy scapegoat. And I think that's a very ongoing sort of trend in not just American politics, but everywhere. You know, find a scapegoat.
So we have a
And
great,
a factor, I know you have, but just very quick, if you don't mind kind of later on. I also think, and I think the panel would agree, the things that, yeah, keep Shawna up at night are also the things that chill my soul and keep me up at night. But just to add a few more on top of that horrific pile is, don't you think also the misinformation, right? So yes, there's a long history in America finding vulnerable scapegoats. And then on top of that, so much through social media, I believe it's the case that Congress tried to pass some restraints on misinformation and disinformation prior to the election, but it wasn't passed, right? So all the distorted information about immigrants and lies about, you know, eating the cats and dogs, and even when you have local business people and elected officials saying, we need these immigrants, we want these immigrants, there was so much distortion and fear mongering. That's what chills my soul based on lies. Like, at least if you felt people were making decisions you disagree with based on something real, it would still be upsetting, but less upsetting, right? And I don't really see how that could end or change.
So I think that if there's a theory of U.S. politics called the weather vane, which is that whenever party wins an election, public opinion will move against that party. In other words, that when Trump was elected president in 2016, polls showed a majority having a much more liberal view of immigration, no wall, legal status. Then when Biden became president, opinion shifted against immigration, build a wall, support people. So there is often a back and forth in public opinion.
But does it worry you that when the public opinion is based on misinformation, you have an even more dire
I think
situation?
it's important to take seriously positions of other people and to see dismay about migration, not simply in those terms, but rather that it does change communities, that it does pose financial pressure on communities, and not see it simply as misinformation.
Not simply, but don't you think that's a fact?
Factors.
I want to go to this question. I think it's a really interesting one from our online participants. Will all the professors lose their jobs if Trump gets rid of the Department of Education? Will K through 12 teachers all lose their jobs?
It's very important to understand that education is, a state government and local matter primarily. And so the Department of Education is a mechanism for dispersing funds fundamentally, like Pell Grants, and, so it's pretty unclear, since those funding mechanisms probably wouldn't be ended, it's hard to know exactly what it would be, and as part of education.
This is the problem with creating policy by tweet or whatever they're called on Truth Social now, to give a declaration like I'm gonna get rid of the Department of Education is actually much harder. Because it has employees, because there are budget lines, right? So are you gonna fire all the people who work for it? Are you gonna discontinue all of the funds? So the majority of K through 12 districts get about 50% of their budget from the federal Department of Education. So are you gonna fire half of the teachers and stop educating half of the students, or are you gonna make up that budget shortfall in the states? Or does the president mean something else? This president is a little bit unique among presidents, in the sense that before a policy has rules, right? Before you figured out how you're gonna do the thing, you proclaim the goal, and that's a bold choice in some circumstances, but in government, it's hard to do. If government has rules, if you're in a government that doesn't have any rules, then it's a lot easier. You just say it, you do it, it's done. I hope we're still in the former, but it is very possible that we're moving towards the latter.
So what was his plan if he was to get rid of the DOP? Like, what, would something else take place of that, or how would
The only thing he said is that he's gonna get rid of it. So as far as we know, that is the entirety of the plan.
I think it was the funding to go to different religious groups.
Yeah, there's lots of
Average
different,
their
like the
Public
details.
education system.
The devil is in the detail, right? So if this goes through by executive order, which maybe it could, because it's an executive branch agency, and so all the executive branch agencies ultimately report, there's like 6 million people, 3 million military, 3 million civilian-ish, depending on the day, who all report to the president as their ultimate boss. So the president has the most authority in that area. And so it is very possible that they could get rid of, but I wonder, because if you decided to eliminate half of the funding for all K through 12 schools, I think you'd have a lot of pushback because a lot of people have children in public schools. And that cuts across a lot of income layers too. So it would be really interesting to see. There's maybe an analogy in the Muslim ban, right? The tweets in the 2016 to 2020 that were tweets, I'm gonna ban all of the Muslims from coming in. And then signs an executive order that's like, I'm gonna ban all of the Muslims from these countries, except not from these countries. And then when it was a specific order, people took it to court, and the courts found that those were in violation of various federal law and constitutional law. So I don't know, but I have learned not to say it can't happen, because it absolutely can happen.
I think I'd maybe read it, I mean, I don't, it is, like, everything here is just so tentative, because who knows what's gonna happen when he's sworn in. I'd probably read those comments in light of, there's sort of a decades-long trajectory of Republican campaigns against public education. And I don't think their intention is to eliminate education. I think their intention is largely to privatize it. So that rather than public universities, rather than public K-12 schools, it's all private and largely probably like religious. A lot of it would be delivered by religious institutions. And the purpose of that, I think, is to introduce inequality, or much more inequality, into the education system. So that to the extent that there's still, education for the masses, that kind of education for people who can't afford $100,000 to go to Harvard or whatever, that kind of education would be vocational education, right? That we still need to educate a public so that, the Trump administration is very corporate friendly, and corporations need workers, right? Corporations don't want critical thinkers, right? They don't want people who've done, degrees in art or political science or whatever. They want people who have the skill and who can do that skill making money for the corporation. And so the more we can make public education kind of like job training, I think that's really the end result. And then we'll have a few elite liberal arts institutions for like the children of rich people But I don't think the plan is to eliminate education, because then the economy. I think it's just to change education so that it serves the economy much more directly.
One last thing on education, one of my concerns is the issue of academic or freedom of speech. That I do worry that he will try to use the Justice Department to, try to stop universities from being accredited if they have professors who have certain politics and things like that. And I think that's, really damaging. It's, we're trained, we have the right to publish and write about what we think, judged by our peers, we have the right to speak up in class. And, and that I think is important. I think you see where Republicans have dominated places like Florida, a real crackdown on academic freedom of speech. And if, through the Justice Department, through the accredited system, through, various ways, including pressures also on state legislatures to sort of follow suit. I hope that won't happen in New York, but I have some worries.
We have another question in person.
Good question about the media law, by the way. I think it's an important issue. In this situation.
I think it's a big factor and scary.
Can we talk about women's healthcare rights and how that would change it? Yeah, I don't want to bring it there, but I know we got a good question, raised.
Well, Trump promised that in the election, that as you know now, abortion is a state by state decision, and Trump endorsed that as a policy going forward. He's accused that he would want a national ban on abortion, but he couldn't get the case. There's likely to be cutbacks on various types of federal programs for healthcare. I think those tend to be unpopular.
So, abortion, when we want to talk broadly about reproductive health care, was protected under Roe v. Wade. Dobbs got rid of that, nope, not anymore. So now it's state by state. In New York, we just had Proposition 1 that passed. So we now have a state constitutional right to reproductive health care. However, states are creatures of the federal government. So if at the federal level, you got some legislation together, and it is possible, it's incredibly unlikely because access to safe abortions is there are very few policy things that are as popular as abortion, right? 70% of Americans are in favor of safe legal abortions, but that's not how we vote on it. It's not surprising to me that the gender split was consistent across all of that more women across every demographic group than men voted for Harris. We are already seeing in the states that do not have access, that no longer have reproductive health care access, people are dying, women are dying, families are being destroyed. New York State isn't one of them so far because we have access still, but that is not guaranteed. We will see more people die. We knew that was the case when it takes a while to get those stories because it takes a while for information to come out. And one of the things that's really interesting is if this is brought to court again. I always teach Roe, I'll continue to teach Roe in my American government class because it's one of the cases where mootness was waived. Generally speaking, the Supreme Court will not look at a case if it's already settled, right? So in the famous abortion case, the baby was born. And usually they would say, I'm not going to look at this because it's already settled, but there's no way a baby, if you've ever been pregnant, it feels like it takes forever, but it doesn't actually take as long as working your way up through the federal legal system would. So it will be interesting to see what kinds of cases will be brought. However, because of the balance that we have currently on the Supreme Court, I don't think any federal relief is coming from there. And the funding is going to get worse too.
Sorry. I heard somewhere that if you live in a state where abortions are prohibited, if you go to a state where they're legal, your facility does not give abortion, they find out keep in that state. Is that true or is that just?
So this is where there is an analogy to be made to certain types of laws, right? States are supposed to give full faith and credit to each other's laws and public acts, but there have been certain instances where states will say no, like, right, we have the fugitives, you can talk about the Fugitive Slave Act as a historian, but Texas has tried to put in legislation that says if you aid or abet someone traveling, right, to get an abortion, other states have put forward this because it turns out they not only want to protect, they don't just want to prevent people from getting abortions within their state, they want to prevent those people from accessing it anywhere. And that's there was a case wasn't Dobbs, it was decided at the same time as Dobbs, but it really gave away the case because Texas was arguing that in the arguments they said, well, you know, if people really want abortion, they can just leave the state. You're like, well, I thought it was about the safety of women. If it's the safety of women, then you wouldn't want them to leave the state for it. He's like, yeah, no, never mind. But that it's already in the record. So it's not great. In terms of could those cases be enforced? There's like a whole world of really interesting laws that might come into play, right? We're seeing more attempts to create fetal personhood, where a fetus is considered a person before the law, so that if you damage a fetus, so there are people currently incarcerated because they used drugs when they were pregnant, and that would be damaging a fetus. Or there's also parental rights, right, where somebody can sue. So in cases, what's the Texas case? The father sued the doctor because his partner, who was involved with domestic violence, got an abortion, and he thought the court found in the favor of the female person who got the abortion. But I'll look up the source on that because you deserve it. That's an important case, but yeah, it's not good.
I just want to mention the exit polls, not about that, just as kind of interesting. I thought that the 2016 election, I think we came to develop a new concept, double hater. People didn't like Trump, people didn't like Hillary Clinton, and Trump wanted the double hater. And we thought that this election, the Democrat might do better. But again, people who don't like Trump or Harris, Trump won at 56 to 30%. So again, double hater for Trump.
I'm sorry, it was Alabama, fetal personhood and IVF. So again, it's not just access to it's not just abortion, but access to other types of reproductive health care. And by the way, the constitutional right, the right to privacy, which is an interpreted right or an implied right, it's not in there in the text specifically, is the same one that gives us marriage equality, access to birth control, and lots of other things like privacy in your phone.
Maybe just wanted to add also that I think the worry with abortion rights isn't that if you travel from a state that doesn't have abortion rights to a state that does have abortion rights, that you'll get denied. I think, you know, if New York State remains a state that provides abortion, anyone can travel here and get an abortion. Providers won't deny that. I don't see a reason why they would. The question is
prosecution from your home state.
Yeah, that's what the worry is. When you return home, whether or not your home state will prosecute you for getting an out-of-state abortion. And I'll maybe just add to that also that, you know, part of the problem with that, I mean, which may be old news because this, you know, access to abortion is a problem that's existed in this country for decades, even before the Dobbs decision, which is that abortion for a long time has been extremely difficult for many people to get, depending on their geography. And so, you know, depending on where you lived, you know, it might be miles and miles. I think, I can't remember, like in El Paso, even before Dobbs, that you have to travel like 8 hours by car or something to the nearest clinic. And there were like millions of people who lived in the city. I don't remember, I want to be on the record for saying it's the city, but that's one of the big issues with now making it even harder to get if you live in a state. It's that, you know, this is particularly going to hit lower income people who can't take several days off of work, who don't have the money to travel out of state, especially if they have to go several states over. And so, you know, people like to talk about how, you know, even if abortion gets banned, what that really means is that abortion is banned for poor people, right? Because rich people, even if there's a national ban, will just hop on a plane and go to France or go to Canada or wherever. That, you know, when you have the means, when you have the money, even things that are banned are still accessible in the way that, parking tickets are just, if you're a billionaire, a parking ticket is just a parking fee, in the same way I pay in a garage. And so the question is like, with more and more restrictions, that abortion is becoming, even if technically there's a way to get it, that from a practical point of view, for more and more people, it isn't, possible.
I just wonder if you want to also talk about Comstock, that might be one of the most likely ways that abortion rights will be.
I'd love you to talk about it.
I can do a very, very high level version of it, which is that most abortions in this country happen through medication abortion, through pills that have been under attack. And if the Comstock Act, which is an act that has not really been enforced since Dobbs, becomes enforced, then it won't be able to be mailed to anywhere in the US, even states that allow abortion.
And Comstock, I mean, the case on Comstock was, it was improper, was it, Connecticut versus Mayor? Where it was improper for government to intrude in the sixties in marital privacy, right? And then, so it was Griswold and then Eisenstadt. So one was, you can't have it in, it's improper for the government to intrude in, marital privacy. So married women have to be allowed access in violation of the Comstock law. It invalidated that part of Comstock that said married women have to be allowed. And then Eisenstadt said, well, if married women are allowed, then equal protection says you have to give it to single women as well. Another question we had from the chat, a panelist stated the negative public sentiment regarding Biden was due to the rise of inflation. What actions or lack thereof did Biden do to actively contribute to rising inflation?
Well, there's two arguments there. One is the Republicans argue that with Biden being president, that he and the Democrats continued this influx of money into the economy to help people get through COVID. And the theory is that when you spend money, you spend more money than the government takes in, you're adding money into the money. And the supply doesn't cause inflation, but the more money is, the less value you might have. That's one theory. The theory of another theory is that inflation hit every Western country because of disruptions in international supply chain due to COVID and various other economic factors that I can't explain because I don't understand them. But so there's two theories. Was it a function of money, of fiscal policy, of money being spent by the government, or was it simply what happened to all the Western countries that had similar inflation for similar periods of time, or was it a combination of those two factors?
Or it's a combination in a way, like
Right.
you have supply chain problems, but you also have, Build Back America, all the different, putting more money, helping people pay their rent, that increases demand, but the supply is not there, will lead to inflation. But I guess the weird thing about it is like, well, first of all, like, what do you do? Like, people can't pay their rent, people like you need to help people. People who are like not, losing their jobs. Did that lead to inflation? Could they have spent less money? That means it would have helped people a little bit less. And one other thing is I think Biden kind of used a disaster in a lot of ways, but the U.S. economy recovered. Jacob, let me know this. Recovered much faster and better than most Western industrialized societies. But the inflation was, so huge, and it had such a big impact on people having to pay more for a variety of things. So Harris was punished at the end. But could he have done something differently? Spent less money? I don't know. Then more people would have suffered.
There would have been high inflation if the government spent less, because there was high inflation in countries that spent less money on COVID relief. That seems logical. Maybe the amount of money that went through when Biden became president added to inflation, but only didn't create it.
I think Michael's point that it's my understanding that the United States is actually recovered from inflation better than comparable countries. So, inflation is sort of an unavoidable fact that we all went through. But if you're looking for effective responses to it, this country did well. And just a couple more points about that, maybe just to mention also, even when talking about, like, we talk about inflation, I'm just suspicious of some of the conversations because, you know, we talk about whether or not those checks that we got, the stimulus checks contributed to inflation, but, you know, the conversation is never about whether or not the PPE loans, right, the larger sum went to businesses. A blank check was given to businesses during COVID to help them recover, which largely went to very wealthy people and business owners. You know, it seems like that amount of money, if we're talking about government stimulus going to cause inflation, that would, you know, be a significant cause as well. And maybe it was, maybe they both were. She also probably talked about price gouging, which we know was at least part of the problem with inflation. That inflation was taking place, and then some businesses took this as an opportunity. Well, if inflation is raising our prices, rather than raising our prices 10%, why don't we raise our prices by 20% and keep that extra 10% as profit for us? And so there were lots of examples of that as well. But I think the whole issue with inflation, part of it is, you know, read some studies that inflation is maybe one of the biggest contributors to this election because inflation is an economic problem that people really feel. It makes people feel insecure. It makes people feel like they're really getting poorer. It's something that people suffer from in their lives. It's not just a dispassionate economic phenomenon. And I think that's probably partially true that, like, you know, you feel it when you go to buy groceries and everything's more expensive. You feel that things are tighter. But the problem with that is that I think this points to a bigger problem with the Democratic Party, which I think is that when it comes to messaging, they are terrible. I think that one of the things that the Republican Party does fantastically well is messaging. I think we've lived in a Republican-controlled world for 40 or 50 years. They have controlled the message so that when Democrats put forward their message, they're playing on a terrain that's largely been shaped by, they're always reacting to Republicans. And I think inflation was a good example of how not only did Biden maybe do okay, even if he could have done more to combat inflation or combat the consequences of inflation for average people, but the fact that there wasn't a larger concerted effort to sort of shape the narrative about inflation to make people felt like they were being heard, like the government was working for them, and to be able to show people sort of tangible ways that the government is dealing with inflation, I think points to one of the Democratic Party's sort of biggest problems, which is that they're just terrible, I think, at PR.
The Democratic Party even denied the inflation many times.
Did
They
they?
didn't accept that there's any inflation. No.
Well, that seems hard, yeah. That seems hard to deny. I think they probably, I mean, I do know that they probably denied the significance of it, maybe that it wasn't as bad for people as they thought. I could see that. But that it exists, I don't know the politicians that sort of denied it as bad. But maybe.
Yeah, so when the war in Ukraine broke out a little over 2.5 years ago, when it was 2022, right? Do you think that could have been when we were sending so much money to the for military aid to the Ukrainian military? Like, you think that could have like jumped up prices in the U.S. Like, for example, like grocery stores, like housing markets, like mortgage, whatnot?
I think it was a little different. I think Ukraine really did contribute to inflation, but it wasn't the spending on Ukraine, it was the Russian invasion. Because if I'm remembering this correct, that Ukraine is responsible for like a vast majority of the world's grain supply, and a lot of products either originate in Ukraine or transit through Ukraine. So even though most people hadn't heard as much about Ukraine, you know, prior to the war, that it's actually really central to the global economy. And so when Russia invaded Ukraine, that's where, you know, it sort of shut down the Ukrainian economy, and it created, you know, we've heard like supply chain problems, right? Supply chain problems, right? That products aren't getting to where they need to go were largely because of Ukraine. And so I don't know that American spending in Ukraine led to inflation, but the Russian invasion, I think, was one of the primary causes.
A little thing about money to Ukraine. It's interesting to think about this, and maybe you guys know this better, but like, would we give money, whatever military aid to Israel or to Ukraine or wherever, Egypt, military aid to lots of people? The money really is in some ways going to American arms producers. So it's kind of funny, the money shows up in Ukraine briefly, but then immediately goes back. And so in some ways, it's a transfer of money from the US government to, an a company that makes arms and whatever, Alexandria, Virginia or something like that. So you could say that was perhaps inflationary as well, besides the supply chain things. It's pushing money into the US economy and overheating the economy.
It's a little, I think, disingenuous of us as people to hold governments accountable for inflation when we won't let them, like, I don't know that a lot of Americans are willing to vote for price controls, right? So that's a primary tool if you want to set price windows or profit maximizations, or if you want to put on corporate tax rates on excess profits. All of those are universally unacceptable, especially on the right side of the aisle, because those are anti-business, that's anti-corporate, right? That dog's never gonna hunt. So then you're just mad. You're mad that your groceries are expensive, and you're mad that they didn't do anything, but you wouldn't vote for doing anything about it. So it just looks like manufactured suffering and manufactured rage.
But the price gouging, this is like bad messaging. At one point, Harris mentions that in a speech, she's gonna go after this, but then she kind of dropped that very quickly. But she was saying, we're gonna, Justice Department, gonna really investigate price gouging, but that was seen as too radical, and so she kind of dropped it. It was a question.
There are $1.6 billion in the Harris campaign and $1 billion in the Trump campaign, and they were not from small donors. Small donors can't donate billions. Do we have one more comment for that?
Yeah, I don't know if this is like whatever. The question is, being that like we're supposed to, like, we the people are supposed to like vote, right? We should vote. Like when I voted, I expected like somebody to look at my ID and say, all right, well, this is you, this is who you are, and I want you to come in here and like you vote, and I didn't get that when I went into like the polls. I didn't get that at all. I just went there and I just kind of frowned upon it, because I'm learning so much from my professor and she's teaching us so much about how this works. And I'm sorry, you're right, I'm not sure like what his name is, but he's from Canada. You have to be very intelligent to actually, or know a little bit, a bit about what you're doing when you're actually in that booth. And all this stuff is like really confusing when you're reading it, and we the people are supposed to make these intelligent choices, right? By picking who is going to be like the next judge, who is going to be the people that are going to be, helping us in general as, as government people, but why aren't they checking our ideas to see like, well, this is who you are?
So this is a really great question.
And why is it that because I did look this up as well, and it said you should have an ID, but they're not doing a great job of saying, well, you know what, this is your ID, this is who you are, and this is great. Please come on in and make your educated vote,
So we don't have we have, it's actually illegal to ask for people's ID to vote in New York State. Some states now are requiring an ID. And while you might think that's like, no, I want them to confirm who I am, we have advanced voter registration, and incidences of voter fraud are extremely rare in the US, right? That someone is saying that there's somebody else. It doesn't really happen that much. The challenge, or the reason that that's probably, I lean in the favor of not requiring a voter ID, is because voter ID is really a poll tax, right? And that was one of the ways that people of color were disenfranchised. And we actually have a constitutional amendment against it, right? You're not allowed to charge people to vote. And there were arguments that said, elections are expensive, you gotta do your part, you have to contribute. There's an argument to be said for it, but it has such a loaded racist history that I don't think it has really any place in what we're doing now. In terms of other things that you said, in terms of the complication, I love that you voted for, you pointed out the judges, like, how am I supposed to vote for these judges? In New York State, I don't know about where you voted, but for me, all of the judges were the same. You could vote for any four of these and they were the same for all three parties or four parties that were listed. So vote for the judges, don't vote for the judges. They've already decided who the judges are. So that's an interesting one. And elected versus appointed judges is a whole other kettle of fish to get into. To finish on a somewhat hopeful note, like the idea of increased participation, I think is always gonna be more helpful and more diverse participation, right? I'm not saying that grandma and grandpa shouldn't vote, I'm saying that their grandchildren should also vote, right? And we should vote together and we should have these conversations, not just at election time, but all of the time, and find other ways to participate as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, and if anyone has any questions or comments, I know a few people have to leave, but I'm happy to stick around and chat with them.
Thank you to our online facilitator, Dr. Corby.
How have you been doing?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your, like,
Hopefully this year, but if not, maybe like the beginning of this.
Okay, yeah. Then, yeah, I can.